Okay, here's a plan for tonight. I am going to spend the first 25 minutes or so describing my own reading of the state of class divisions in America. At the end of which time, those of you in the audience who are of the persuasion left of center are going to say, Murray has just made a wonderful case for social democracy. And then I will spend the remaining 15 minutes trying to explain an alternative way of looking at what needs to be done. And as I go about that, let me suggest that I will understand that I am not going to convince those of you who don't agree with me, and you don't spend all your time trying to think of why I'm wrong. Just go ahead and listen to this alternative view of a perspective on social policy, and at the end of it all we can have a discussion among ourselves. Okay, let's start with the proposition that the last 50 years has seen the development of social classes that are different in kind from anything that this country has known before. We have always had rich people and poor people. That's not new. Rich people and poor people have always lived in somewhat different parts of town. That's not new. The divisions that we have seen over the last 50 years are on basic cultural institutions. Let me start to make this case by talking about what I refer to as the new lower class. And I'm going to use 4 sets of indicators. There is a rationale for those indicators that's in the book, and I won't try to go into that right now. The first of these is marriage. The second one of them is industriousness. The third is honesty. And the fourth is religiosity. Okay, I'll give you a 2-sentence description of the rationale. The founders all explicitly said the Constitution won't work unless you have people who already possess a certain set of characteristics, of virtues. And the 4 that they all mentioned in one way or another are the 4 I just mentioned. Okay, that's the backdrop there. The paradigmatic example of the new division that occurred is marriage, an absolutely central social institution. And here are the samples I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about non-Latino whites ages 30 to 49. And I do that to just sweep away a whole lot of complicating factors. 30 to 49, that's the prime of life. Non-Latino whites means that all of the complications associated with the different fortunes of different ethnic groups in this country are put aside. All right, for that limited group, 1960, the percent that were married among those who were college educated and working in managerial positions or in the professions was 94%, which is just about as close to unanimity as you can get on participation in any major social institution. But among the working class, which I operationally define as no more than a high school diploma and working in a blue-collar job or a low-level service job, percent married was 84%. Skip ahead 50 years to 2010. Among the upper middle class, college educated and so forth, marriage is down to 84%. But it's still the overwhelming norm. And not only is it the overwhelming norm, the reductions in marriage actually occurred during the 1960s and 70s and had stabilized by the mid-1980s. And not only that, divorce has been going down since then, so marriage is alive and well in the upper middle class. In the white working class, ages 30 to 49, as of 2010, 48% were married. That's from 84% to 48%. And by the way, that trend line shows no signs of shallowing whatsoever. That is a huge change in a fundamental social indicator. That also has reverberations, marriage does, for all kinds of other things, among them being work. There's a long econometric literature about the marriage premium that's associated with males, whereby men do better in the labor force because they are married. Now, there is a lot of controversy in the literature about the causal structure of all this. I think it's only controversy which could exist within academia. I mean, who does not realize that when guys get married, they do tend to settle down and focus and do better, and when they aren't married, they tend to be a little less civilized. That seems to me, I feel on safe ground in making that claim. But the fact is that you've seen at the same time that you've had a profound change in marriage, you've had a profound change among the white working class males in their stance toward the labor force. So that in 1960, if you were white, male, of this age group, and you were not in the labor force, you were a bum. You were considered to be a bum by your girlfriend, by your parents, by your neighborhood. And by the way, this could be true as well even if you were wealthy. The effete upper class and the people who clipped coupons were not looked upon as being objects of praise. And as a consequence, just about everybody was in the labor force. As of 2008, before the recession set in, you were up to 12.5% of the white working class out of the labor force, males, 1 out of 8. Furthermore, this figure has been trending upward in a secular fashion in good times and bad. So we can get into an argument during the Q&A about the nature of the changing economy and explaining this. I got to tell you something. We have had in the late 1990s, for a period of 4 or 5 years, an economy in which there were jobs available for anybody who wanted to take them for as many hours as they wanted to work and well above the minimum wage. And you did not see males flocking back to the labor force over that period of time. This trend has been going up for a long time. Honesty, that gets into crime numbers and the changes in lower class communities opposed to upper class communities. I know crime has been going down for the country as a whole. It is still at about 3 to 4 times the rate it was in 1960 in the white working class neighborhoods. Religiosity. It's interesting that the founders thought religiosity was so important because a lot of the founders themselves were either deists or if they were Christians, they were a little iffy on some of the doctrinal details. They all agreed that if you were going to have a free society, what you had to have above all else was self-government, starting at the individual level, and that religion was an indispensable measure of that. Well, here's where the data are counterintuitive, at least for me. Because I had, along with other people, assumed that religion was alive and well in the working class and it was the pointy-headed intellectuals who had become secular. Well, the latter part is true. The pointy-headed intellectuals, which is to say, if you get up into college faculties, especially in elite colleges, the rates of atheism and agnosticism and lack of observance, religious observance are very, very high. But in the middle class as a whole, whereas there has been an increased secularization, it is dwarfed by the plunge in religiosity in the white working class. Now, take all of these 4 things together and you have an upper middle class in this country and a working class in this country which are separated in ways they did not used to be. I will come back to why this is important, but let me switch now to the formation of the new upper class. This, by the way, one of the nice things of having co-authored the Bell Curve is that so few people actually read the book that I was able to recycle a lot of the arguments from the Bell Curve in this one. And so a lot of these arguments are 20 years old, but I am rather proud of Dick and Herrnstein and myself for putting these on the table a lot earlier than other people had done. Over the course of the 20th century, you had 2 great phenomena that transformed the prospects for the American upper class. The first of, and both of them were good in some respects. They had collateral effects that are problematic. The first of these is that the American college system got much more efficient in identifying talent, no matter where it came from and how much money the parents had or where in the country they were, and shipping these kids off to the best colleges. The example I like to use for that is my alma mater, Harvard. In 1952, the incoming freshman class at Harvard had SAT verbal scores of about 580. That was the mean. Okay, those aren't bad scores. They are very middling scores. Harvard was a place with a lot of rich kids and a few really smart ones. By 1960, just 8 years later, that had gone up by a full standard deviation. The mean SAT verbal score was in the 680s at that point, and Harvard had become a place with a lot of smart kids and some of whom are rich. The same thing was happening throughout the American university system. And that's good. I mean, it's good that you were giving people a chance. But you had collateral effects that came along with that. One is that you were introducing a kind of assortative mating that did not exist before, which is to say, you know, who did a highly successful male marry in 1930, 1920? He probably married the girl next door when he was 20 years old, and who was not selected for IQ. Or he married, if he married after he'd already gotten some money, he married a woman at the country club, and she also was not selected for IQ. Doesn't mean she's dumb, it just means she's not selected to be particularly smart. Who does that same man marry today? He marries a woman that he meets because she's litigating against his firm in some dispute. You know, the New York Times marriage page on Sunday is the place to go to see the phenomenon I'm talking about, also known as the merger and acquisitions page. I mean, it is MBA from Stanford, working at McKinsey, getting engaged to a partner at one of the leading Fifth Avenue law firms and so forth. And that also has gone on a large scale, and that has implications because I know how touchy a topic IQ is. It is an empirical statement of fact that the correlation of the midpoint of parental IQ and children's IQ is 0.5. Doesn't make any difference whether that's genetic or whether that's environmental. That's the correlation. And when you have people getting married who are both going to provide a super environment and also providing super genes, they are going to throw off the great majority of the next generation who are at also very high levels. Yes, you have regression to the mean. So the average kids of any of these parents will be regressing toward the mean. But if you ask where are the next set of kids with IQs of 140 coming from, they are going to come overwhelmingly from that group. That has implications down the road. A second thing that happens is that you change the socialization process that goes on in a university like that. And I guess maybe the better illustration for something like this is what elite neighborhoods were like in 1960 compared to what elite neighborhoods are like now. I identified, using census data from the 1960 census, median family income and percentage of adults with a BA for 14 neighborhoods that were known as where the rich people and powerful people lived in 1960. North Shore of Chicago, Upper East Side of New York, Northwest Washington, Bel Air and Beverly Hills in Los Angeles, and so forth. It's fascinating. For all 14 of those neighborhoods, the median family income in 1960, expressed in 2010 dollars, is $84,000. That's not affluence. $84,000 in 2010 dollars is sort of middle class, but no more than that. 26% of adults in those 14 neighborhoods had bachelor's degrees, which meant that your typical couple in those elite neighborhoods consisted of one person with a college degree and one person with a high school diploma. That introduces a whole lot of heterogeneity in the socialization that the partners are brought to the marriage. It brings a whole lot of heterogeneity to the nature of life in the community. And those figures on income also mean that even though it's true that you have really rich people living in the North Shore of Chicago in 1960, you also had a lot of people who weren't that rich living in the North Shore of Chicago. Then you transfer up to the 2000 census, and I've updated those numbers for 2010. They tell the same story. Median family income in those 14 neighborhoods was now about $160,000, where you are talking about affluence. And you also now were up to about 70% with bachelor's degrees. And not only bachelor's degrees, advanced degrees. Both members of the family have advanced degrees. And also there is a real concentration of degrees from elite colleges in those neighborhoods. The whole characteristic of those neighborhoods changes dramatically because of those large social forces. The second large, huge phenomenon that occurred during the 20th century was that brains became a lot more valuable in the marketplace. The obvious example of this is IT. If you were somebody with super math skills in 1920, but you did not have good social skills, and actually we know people like that, don't we? If you were like that, you could teach math, you could be an actuary, there was not a real high demand for your services. You have exactly the same skill set now, you know, borderline Asperger's, but you have really super programming skills. Silicon Valley will be dangling six-figure salaries in front of you, and the quant investment funds in New York will be offering you realistic prospect of wealth beyond your wildest dreams of avarice. But the same thing happens in all the other professions. Look, if you have someone, if you have a CEO who can raise the profitability of a firm by 5%, and he's working for a firm that does $50 million a year of business, that CEO is worth $1 figure. If that firm is doing $50 billion worth or $100 billion worth of business, his value in the marketplace is hugely greater. If you were an attorney in 1920, you could handle the kinds of problems that people have, and you would have a good income. You would be among the affluent members of your community. You wouldn't be fabulously wealthy, because a lot of the things that we have now didn't exist then. Now, if you are a really good attorney with the cognitive skills along with the personal skills to be able to negotiate these incredibly elaborate and complicated mergers, you're worth commissions of millions of dollars. If you can navigate through the labyrinth of the Washington regulatory system, you can get results that are worth tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars to a corporation, and you're worth your four-figure fee, four-figure per hour fee. So you have had also at the same time that you got a lot of the talent into the best schools, you also had going on an economy which rewards that kind of thing, which is measured by IQ tests. The result of that is a kind of isolation, which, well, I'm sure you see it in places like Boulder. You know, this is the kind of thing which is kind of hard to get data on, and so I constructed a test in the book in which I asked 25 questions to try to get my readers to understand the degree to which they were living in a bubble. Because the readers of a book like Coming Apart are not randomly selected. I know very well that I'm getting a lot of the people I'm talking about in the new upper class who are reading a book like that. Some of the questions are very, you know, standard social science stuff. Did you ever live for at least a year in your life in a family that had an income below the poverty line? Have you ever lived for at least a year in a neighborhood in which fewer than 50% of the people had college degrees? Some of the questions are mischievous. Has you or your wife in the past year stocked your refrigerator with a mass market American beer? The new upper class despises mass market American beer. If that beer was not made in Liechtenstein by elves, you aren't going to buy it. Other questions, have you ever walked on a factory floor? Not even worked in one. Have you ever seen a factory floor? Another question, which I think probably if I had to select the one that's the most important question of the 25, it would be, have you ever held a job that caused a body part to hurt at the end of the day? Because what has happened is that we have lots of people who are rising to influence or have risen to influence already in this country who grew up in upper middle class neighborhoods in good K-12 schools. They went off to elite colleges. They spent their summers not waiting on tables in Colorado National Park. They did it as interns at AEI or Brookings or someplace like that. Internships are affirmative action for the rich. We do understand that, right? Who are the only people that can afford to take internships? They go from that to law school or to graduate school, and they move seamlessly into a high-paying job. They never come in contact with mainstream America. And the problem with that is it's asymmetrical. It doesn't make any difference if a truck driver cannot empathize with the priorities of a network news anchor person. It makes a lot of difference if an anchor person or a cabinet official or a Yale law professor cannot empathize with the priorities of a truck driver. because their decisions, their actions affect the culture and the politics and the economy of this country, and they really ought to know what the hell they're talking about when they take those actions. They ought to know what mainstream America is all about, and a lot of them don't. Okay, so I've sketched out something which could be rephrased in terms that are familiar in the political dialogue. What's happened is we've had a globalized economy, good jobs have gone away, we don't have the unions providing these wonderful wages they used to provide. We've had crony capitalism that has produced these huge wages, and what we need then is Dutch-style social democracy. There's a rationale for that. I mean, I would dispute a lot of the statements I just made as not being as simple or as true as is often presented, but it's an argument that can be made. Here is what I see as the larger problem. And here's the point at which I get, don't try to argue with me in your mind. Just listen to me and say, well, this is kind of curious and a little odd, but it's interesting. What we need is a society in which everybody of all levels of ability can live a satisfying life. And the least of those problems is having enough income to live a satisfying life. There's lots of work that's been done on happiness. It's become a cottage industry the last 10 or 12 years, but there's, it's what one would expect. You cannot pursue happiness if you're starving, if you are living at a miserable level, but once you get to a certain level, added material goods don't add much to that. Let me propose another way of thinking about living a satisfying life. The proposition is there are very few domains within which people do that. I think there are just 4. And those are vocation, and I will include in that avocations. Or causes, the things that people feel passionately about and they devote their lives to. That's one source of deep and lasting satisfaction. Family is another source of deep and lasting satisfaction. Community is a third source, and faith is another. And I guess I will ask this audience, as I ask lots of audiences, if you can think of a 5th domain, which is a source of deep and lasting satisfaction in life, then let's bring it up in the Q&A, because I don't know of any others. Now, you don't have to tap into all 4 to be happy. There are happy atheists, there are happy single people, but you better tap into a couple of them. And here we come to, I think, the dilemma that the advanced world has not really come to grips with. And that is that for these institutions of meaning, is what one person calls them, and I will adopt that. These institutions of meaning, in order to be vital, have to be filled with important things to do. Which is to say that if you are working at, let's say, a low-skill menial job, if you could quit that job tomorrow and your family be just as well off as they are now, a lot of the meaning of that job has gone out of it. If you are, for that matter, working at a job, but you're the nephew of the person who owns the company, you get a promotion because you're the nephew and not because you've done your job well, there a lot of the satisfaction of vocation is taken away from you. Just as a lot of the satisfaction of vocation is taken away if you work in the civil service, where you're going to get a lockstep promotion now and then just because of your seniority. And by the way, these assertions, there's lots of experimental and empirical evidence in this too. It's the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic rewards, and intrinsic rewards actually compete with intrinsic rewards in a lot of ways. And my larger point is that as you're working at a job, it's really important that what you are doing, you can legitimately say to yourself, is a good use of my time. Same thing is true of marriage and family. To the extent that marriages are filled with responsibility, then marriage is a vital institution. To the extent that marriage is drained of responsibilities, it becomes a much weaker institution and a much less satisfying institution. And I could go on with community as well. and with faith as well. Here's the problem. If you have, let's take the European model. To the extent that you have a very extensive welfare state, you inherently, inevitably, ineluctably drain all four of those institutions of a lot of their content. This is not something you can overcome by clever social engineering. It is embodied in the by definition, government programs in all of these areas are intended to take some of the trouble out of life. And sometimes you want the trouble to be taken out of life. I want a police force so that when I walk home at night, some of the trouble out of getting home safely is taken away from me. I am also happy to see a government in which some of the trouble of not starving is taken away. I have written a book called In Our Hands, which advocates a guaranteed basic income, which would cost just as much as the system we have now. So we're not talking about money here. What I am saying is that insofar as the government interventions say, that's all right, we will take some of the responsibility for raising the child away, we will take some of the responsibility for holding on to a job and getting promotions, and this, we'll sort of soften that too. We will soften for, well, in terms of religion, we will pay for all the churches to be beautifully maintained. You drive through Sweden, it's gorgeous. They have all these, every town has this beautiful Lutheran church maintained by the state. Nobody goes to them, but they have these beautiful churches. When I say it's a dilemma, I'm saying that it should be a dilemma if you're a social democrat too. You can come out with the conclusion saying, yeah, I still think this is the best way to run a society. You've got to recognize that cost. And what we are looking forward to within not a very many years is the prospect of a whole lot of people who are dispensable in terms of the economy. That automation will have increased to the point that really they don't have skills that make them worth hiring. We'll have the money, probably, to provide them with plenty of food and shelter and the rest of it. They will be living dreary, meaningless lives. They will be living dreary, meaningless lives. And, okay, I can't talk any louder than this. No, I don't. They will be living dreary, meaningless lives. And so we ought to be thinking right now about how you construct a society in which they have niches that are important. And by that, I don't mean you pat people on the head and say you should have high self-esteem. I'm not talking about make work. I'm talking about the kinds of roles that vital communities create. It is very easy for those of us who are in the new upper class, which is pretty much people in this room, to get along without community. A lot of us are very happy in our vocations, and a lot of us are married and are happy in our families. We have full lives in that regard, and actually getting away from the community is something we want to do. We want to have our house on a 3-acre plot up in the mountains with a good view, and we aren't engaged in PTA meetings and city council meetings and things like that. For a great many people, the geographic community is still really potentially important and potentially crucial. And also it is a place where roles can be found that give life genuine meaning. I live in a town of, my wife and I have taken it to an extreme. We live in a town of 172 people. You don't have to go down that small, but the fact is that we have we have some people in that town who, if they were in a larger anonymous community, would be miserable, and they aren't miserable in our town because they do stuff in our town that helps keep the town together, and we all know it and we value it. Well, we have to have vital communities. And that forces you to then to think back, how is it that you have vital communities? Communities have to have responsibility for doing things, because if communities don't have genuine responsibilities for doing things, then you don't have the impetus for communities to form and to be vital. And if you say, oh, well, why don't you try to do those things, and if you don't succeed at them, we, the state, will move in and do them for you, you're back in the problem again. So that's why I'm saying these issues should be important to people across the political spectrum, because they are problems, no matter whether you are a libertarian or whether you're a social democrat. What do I see as the realistic prospects, having said all that? I think the realistic prospect is that we are going to have a kind of dystopia. I think that we are moving in the European direction. I think we will have a large new lower class, tens of millions of people who are not engaged in the labor force, who are not married, they have no deep, intimate relationships with other people, who do not have any faith, and who are also living in worlds that are pretty bad in terms of just day-to-day getting by without being engaged in the kinds of threats that we have seen and actual violence in our worst inner city communities. That seems to be the trend that we have not managed to figure out how to reverse. If that is going to reverse, and I'm not going to offer any panaceas to conclude here, but I will just say in a few sentences, I think it is going to have to be the new upper class that takes the lead. I think that one of the worrisome things about the new upper class is that whereas they are quite affluent, quite well educated, and living in terms of their own lives, satisfying lives in many ways, I think it is hollow at the core. The phrase I use in the book is that the new upper class is living their own lives pretty well, but they refuse to preach what they practice. And so, well, marriage works for us, but of course we can't tell other people that that might not work for them. And a variety of other ways in which non-judgmentalism has to stop. And you need to have a confident, a self-confident upper class that is willing to talk about virtue, talk about better ways of behaving versus worse ways of behaving, talk about the meaning of life, and talk about these things not really preaching as we know and we're going to tell you, but engaging with those issues, understanding that the sources of satisfaction in the lives of human beings at the other end of society are the same as the sources of satisfaction in your life. Is there any prospect for the kind of reawakening I'm talking about? I kind of doubt it. But the nice thing about the reception of the book, it came out over a year ago, is that it didn't attract violent opposition. For me, that's, you know, I have a very low bar. I have a very low bar in terms of reactions to the book. But you have people like Nick Kristof in the New York Times saying, well, Murray's politics are nuts, but he's talking about a real problem. And that's the first step. And insofar as we can agree that there is a real problem, then I'm perfectly happy to debate where we ought to go next. Thanks very much.